Hey Gear Seekers, I'm Nick. This is the Minisforum MS-01. This is the most interesting mini PC we've seen for a while, and we did a full video about this a couple weeks ago. Basically, we came to the conclusion that we wanted to run our server off this using a hypervisor, and we couldn't decide which hypervisor we wanted to use, so I needed to do a whole bunch of testing. That's what this video is about, guys. I wanted to show you the solution that I came up with, and it might be one that is quite surprising to you. Plus, we did a couple upgrades. Check it out. We've got a storage card in here because we're going to pass this through to our TrueNAS virtual machine. But before that, here's a word from today's video sponsor. It's your mum, again. Actually, it's Claire. How's the one?
This video is brought to you by VIPSCDKey.com. Have you ever installed Windows 11 only to see the watermark of death? You don't need to fork out a couple of $100s for a key. You can grab one from today's video sponsor, from VIPSCDKey.com for 1/10 of the price. You can use our code GEAR to get 30% off for this month only. How good is that? That takes that already cheap Windows 11 key and makes it even cheaper. It's easy as placing your order. Bingo bango. You've got your new key on your orders page. You chuck that key into the activation screen and you're good to go. No more watermark of death. Use code GEAR to get 30% off for this month only. Link in the description. On with the video. Back to you, Nick.
What are we looking at?
It's funny that you said that, dude, because when you look at the labels, it says Mr. Sass. Man, that's me half the time, Mr. Sass. When I did the first part of this video, I talked about getting this LSI storage card. It was already on order by the time I'd made this video. And this is it here. I don't know what model it is, but this is one of these newer PCIe Gen 3x8 controllers. And I mentioned that, you know, it's probably gonna fit, and I measured it and it should fit. And lo and behold, it fits. The thing with LSI cards is they're all 16.6 or 166 millimeters long, and this apparently is 170 mil. So you do the math, we've got 4 mil to play with, and I would say that there is 4 mil to play with, and the card fits perfectly. So if you're getting an MS-01 to do some type of storage with TrueNAS or whatever it is, we don't use Unraid here because Unraid's garbage. Yeah, it works, it fits, it's really, really good. And I'm surprised because when this card was in its box, it was sitting next to the MS-01. I'm like, oh, that looks too big. And it went in without a hitch. The other thing is this uses the 8088 connector, which our disk shelf already uses. So I was like, you know, I want to make this as easy as possible. One thing I wasn't sure about, given that I don't really do low profile cards in many of our systems, was if I had two of these next to each other, was it gonna work? And yeah, obviously it's all good. Let's take a look at some hypervisors now. I tested 3. Should we start off with Proxmox, XCP-ng, or ESXi? This is a choose your own adventure, guys. So actually, it's not at all. That's not how that works. Before we start, I just wanted to mention that this is not a tutorial on how to set up any hypervisors. This is not a technical deep dive into how any of these hypervisors work. If you want some resources on how to set any of this stuff up, there's lots of communities online, there's lots of resources, lots of forums like the Level 1 Text Forum, also Lawrence Systems on YouTube, and just plenty of resources on YouTube to find out how to do all of this stuff. Basically, I'm just scratching the surface on our deployment and what we use to test to come up with the best solution with whatever ends up going on the Minisforum MS-01. Also, with these hybrid core CPUs, a thing that we found, and I mentioned this in the first part when we first checked this out, was I didn't have any problems with both XCP-ng or Proxmox with getting this to work. ESXi was a bit of a different story, and it's not worth making a whole video on how to get it to work because it's one boot flag that you need to change and it's all good. So with all that said, yeah, let's jump in. The thing is with XCP-ng, it's not your regular hypervisor. Basically, the way this works is you need to use the Zen Orchestra application, and this is another virtual machine that sits on your hypervisor or your host. And the way I've got this set up through all of this testing is we've got 3 virtual machines that I've been testing on this. There's a lot of really good configuration options with XCP-ng, as you can see here, and a lot of different tweaks we can make. One of the main drawbacks of XCP-ng is the network interfaces, or the virtual networking interfaces here. And there is ways around it, but we're not going through that in this video because this isn't a tutorial. I just wanted to show you the way I tested this to come to the conclusions that I did. So with XCP-ng and Xen Orchestra, the dashboards aren't too bad. It shows us enough information. The virtual consoles are really good. So if you need to access your virtual machine on the host through Orchestra, it's really easy to just log in and check a few things. So as you can see here, we've got Windows Server 2022. This is one of the virtual machines we already have, and this is a clean install just for testing to see what it does in these situations. Other than that, we've obviously got our TrueNAS scale virtual machine, which is used for testing, because I wanted to show you guys the PCIe pass-through, because that's the most important thing with using any of these virtual machines and any hypervisor. The next thing is I always have a Windows 11 virtual machine on all of our hosts, or Windows 10 for remote access and just doing a few little things. Like, let's say I wanted to upload a YouTube video and I wanted to walk away and let it do it in the background. I didn't want to have a computer on. That's one of the reasons why I have a remote desktop setup for that kind of stuff. But I wanted to show you guys the TrueNAS setup here. So what I've done is I've passed the storage controller and a single NVMe M.2 drive through to this virtual machine. I'll show you kind of how this is configured, but if we just take a look at a few of the settings here, we'll take a look at the disks that are connected, and you will see that the NVMe drive, which is a 250 gig Samsung drive just for testing, is connected, and I've created a storage pool on it with a single drive. So it's not a very complicated setup, but all of this seems to work. Now, to set it up, I won't show you the exact setup, but shout out to Lawrence Systems for giving me the tools I needed to do this. But essentially, we've got our storage controller and we've got the PCIe ID. We need this to pass it through, and every device that's connected to the bus as well, let's say the NVMe drive, is also got its own PCIe ID. And basically what we've done is we'd say, hey, we want to use these PCIe IDs to be able to pass through to any virtual machine. And this command basically showed that in action, that everything is set to be passed through. Well, those two anyway. This command here then attaches the PCIe devices to a certain virtual machine based on the UUID. And this is assigned inside Xen Orchestra. And like I said, like, the dashboards here are really nice. It's really easy to see what's going on here. Like I said, 4 virtual machines here. We're using all of the 32 gigs of RAM that are in the MS-01 from factory. And I do have more memory coming, but in terms of getting this video out quicker, we decided to test with the minimum memory that we could. And 32 gigs seems to be enough, but there are a couple drawbacks with XCP-ng. Now, some hypervisors dynamically assign memory, and some slice off memory if you have PCIe devices connected to it. The thing with Xen is, if you're not attaching PCIe devices to a virtual machine, it still slices that memory off and allocates it to that virtual machine. And that's mainly to do with how the Xen hypervisor works. And as mentioned, like, there's a lot of different configuration options here for your virtual machine. I think XCP-ng for most use cases is more than adequate. Just be aware though, the networking may be an issue if you're not willing to assign physical network devices to your virtual machines. The other thing I like is the hub. These are templates for virtual machines, and essentially you can hit install and it will deploy it to a cluster, a certain host, or whatever. You can also set up Kubernetes really quickly. This is good for people who are doing software development and just want an easy way to redeploy things. And I mean, XCP-ng for most people's use cases is going to be more than adequate, but there are other options here. While I was testing and screen capturing, I was writing down notes the whole time with all of the tests that I was doing, so I can go back to what I was thinking when I was doing the testing to give you guys a bit of an understanding why I did or didn't choose the hypervisor based on whatever happened. So first of all, some notes about XCP-ng. It's free. You can get it for free. You can pay for extra support, but essentially it's free. Xen Orchestra is also free. It's not something you need to pay for, but with saying that, you do miss a bit of memory allocation with having Xen Orchestra running on your host. There are ways of building virtual machines without using it, but the easiest way to deploy it, and the way that I would recommend, is using Xen Orchestra in a virtual machine on your host, right? That's the easiest way. The other thing is memory allocation and consumption is pretty high with XCP-ng, and it can slow down some virtual machines and make them unstable. The host itself is not affected. So if you log in locally on the local console, it's generally okay. I tested this on a non-hybrid CPU as well, just on a Ryzen chip that we had with the same memory, and I found that to be the case as well. So when you get close to that memory allocation limit, it really slows down Xen Orchestra and all the virtual machines and the way you interact with it as well. And like I said, if you want to stop a virtual machine or reset something, you need to physically log into that machine on the metal in XCP-ng and stop the virtual machine. There's just no way around it with the testing that we did. And it also causes XO Lite to hang. And XO Lite, basically, I didn't really talk about it, but if you use the IP address for the host, not for Xen Orchestra, there is a web interface, but it's very, let's call it, it's very immature at the moment. There's not a lot you can do other than start and stop virtual machines and look at resource allocation on your host. Other than that, yeah, they've got a lot of work to do on that. And apparently it's coming in the next few months or whatever it is. Other than that, I would say that given the memory constraints, and this is just because this is the configuration that I've got here, it would be okay. And I wrote this, but if I needed to cluster with high availability, I would probably choose XCP-ng because it is just really easy to set up. There's also a great community. There's lots of resources and documentation. And again, there was no tweaking required to get this to work on the MS-01. It just worked straight out of the box. But one thing to note is I didn't use the 8.2 release. I used the 8.3 beta because it just had a couple more features and it's more stable from what I can tell as well. Onto Proxmox. Proxmox is very popular, and with the Max Exodus from VMware, this has been most people's hypervisor of choice. And as you can see here, like with XCP-ng, you can allocate your PCIe devices to your virtual machine, but Proxmox is really easy. You don't need to use any command line to do this here. Essentially just map it and power up your virtual machine, and those PCIe devices are connected to that virtual machine. One thing about Proxmox is it is stupidly easy to configure and manage. And again, this is why people have decided to go from VMware to Proxmox. Also, it's free. As with XCP-ng, we also had those other two virtual machines here for testing. Similar thing with the console setup here. You can send keystrokes to the console to log into your virtual machines. All of these are fresh installs for each hypervisor, so there's nothing left over from the others. Windows 11 is the same story here. There is something interesting to note here though, and this is kind of the way that we do it. We net boot our virtual machines from a PXE server on our network, and usually you need to attach a compatible network device and then switch it to VirtIO and then reinstall the network driver. So that is something you need to really think about. But Proxmox with virtual adapters and virtual switches and bridges and all of that stuff is super easy to configure. But it is a bit of a learning curve if you're not used to the regular Linux terminology. Unlike VMware, which doesn't use Linux terminology, it uses its own terminology. But our most important virtual machine, once again, is TrueNAS scale. As you can see, I've got that same M.2 drive passed straight through to the TrueNAS virtual machine. This was a breeze to set up, no command line, nothing. Just click it, assign, and you're good to go. So everything here is fine. This is the same data set and the same volume that I created on an XCP-ng to show you guys that you can import volumes very easily, even if you decide to switch to a different hypervisor at a later time. You know, it's completely up to you. You can do whatever you like. And that's the good thing about Proxmox. Even if you're migrating from VMware ESXi over to Proxmox, it makes it really easy. Another thing with Proxmox is configuring the host itself and all the virtual machines on the host. Assigning cores and switching things to UEFI is really easy. You get a lot of different statistics of the host itself and what it's doing and how it's consuming memory and where it's allocating memory to and the delay between the I/O for all of your virtual machines and the metal itself. So for someone that likes numbers and graphs, Proxmox, I think, is a little bit better than XCP-ng and Zen Orchestra. But the Zen stuff is changing at a later date. They're doing XO Lite, but that's a whole nother video for a whole nother time. As you can see here quickly, you can see that this is on the MS-01 with the CPU info and everything. But yeah, like, this isn't a tutorial on how to set this all up. This is just giving you an idea of why I went the way I did. Like you can see, we've got clustering, we've got Ceph built in, super easy to configure, super easy to see all of your statistics. So Proxmox is looking like a good contender for this because it is very flexible, it is widely used, it is widely supported, and there are a lot of rolling updates that make this great for either a business or someone who's in a home lab wanting to tinker and always having the latest, greatest Linux kernel. Also, I wanted to mention something about Proxmox and XCP-ng. With these hybrid CPUs and these hybrid cores, I had zero issues with running any virtual machines. Even over provisioning cores seemed to work fine, and there was no problem creating and deploying virtual machines. So yeah, but there are a few little kinks. There are a couple little kinks that may make VMware your hypervisor of choice, even though Broadcom just sucks. All right, onto Proxmox again. I wrote down a whole bunch of notes here. It's free. Proxmox is free. There are enterprise packages you can purchase and like a subscription you can have, but essentially it's free. It's basically just a really nice Linux distro that is wrapped up in a nice bundle to make virtualization really easy. It's got great memory management, and even when your memory is fully provisioned, it's quite stable. I did find a few times where it was kind of hard to connect to the console or stop virtual machines, but it would eventually respond, unlike XCP-ng, which would just give you no access other than going onto the host and then logging in and doing all that stuff. So yeah. Also, having an easy way to set up and provision Ceph right in your web interface is pretty amazing. There's almost no time that you need to use a command line, console, or a shell to do anything with Proxmox. It's become so mature that there's a reason why people are jumping from ESXi to Proxmox. These are the little things why. And if you're trying to learn how to set up a hypervisor that is quite technical and complicated, and you don't have a lot of experience, I think that Proxmox is really nice too. The other thing to mention is networking can be confusing if you're not versed in Linux networking terminology, but ultimately, again, there's lots of resources, lots of videos, and there's a lot of things online to help you. Basically, whatever you can imagine doing with your virtualization setup, someone's already done it with Proxmox. As well as that, there is one major issue that I had with Proxmox, which is maybe why I wouldn't choose it for this machine. And it's to do with stability. Now, this is a bit of a weird one because I said earlier that the stability was really good, because it was. Everything worked really well, except every now and again, the MS-01 would just turn off. And I haven't ever seen this happen with the MS-01 with any other operating system, but it randomly happened on the MS-01. So I don't know what's going on there. I couldn't find any log as to what was going on with it as well. It just turned off and there was just nothing logged to say why it was doing it. It just did, which is really, really annoying. And again, with Proxmox, zero tweaking to get it to work with these hybrid CPUs with big and little cores. So yeah, it is a good option, but randomly powering off, that can be a bit scary for me. Especially if we lose data because our host just decides to turn off. So, alrighty, ladies and gents, on to the big bad, VMware ESXi 8. Now, this is the most mature code base for any of the hypervisors, and it is the most widely supported in the industry. But as we know, Broadcom for making it terrible, them for changing the licensing model. But despite all of that, it is still one of the most solid hypervisors, and there is a reason why I got certified in VMware and why I did it as a job, because it was the best. Now, For PCIe pass-through, really easy. You just select the PCIe devices. The way they're labeled here is the same as you would find in a Linux-based one. Also, the PCIe IDs are the same, and you just toggle the pass-through on the devices you want, and you'll go into the settings for your virtual machine. You'll go add other device, PCIe device, and you can see here M.2 just comes up, hit save, and then you launch your virtual machine. And one thing you're probably already noticing is ESXi for launching virtual machines and provisioning stuff is just faster, and it's just because of how mature it is. Our Windows 11 virtual machine, even the responsiveness in the console is better than both XCP-ng and Proxmox. It just is, and that's mainly to do with how they're accessing the console as well. As mentioned earlier, with the way that we boot our virtual machines to install them, we need to use a compatible device that's compatible with PXE, and we have an Intel E1000 virtual adapter that works flawlessly every time. The VMware adapter for 10 gig and above just does not work here. That being said, we install VMware tools and then change the adapter, and we get our full 10 gig through to our physical network layer, well, the virtual physical network layer. It's hard to explain, but yeah, it's a VMware thing. In TrueNAS on ESXi, you can see we've also got the same M.2 drive passed through to the virtual machine. Something else I wanted to show here quickly was I haven't imported the pool, and when we import the pool, it's really easy to do. It takes a few seconds, and then whatever I had set up with the other hypervisors is here. Don't worry about this warning here, guys. It's just a single drive pull for testing. We just want to know that PCIe pass-through works. Lastly, I have some notes on ESXi and some things that I found with this setup in particular. Let's get it out of the way. Fuck Broadcom. They're the big bad right now. Their licensing is too expensive and their ongoing support is just too expensive. So unless you already have a license or you're not willing to upgrade your hypervisor, I would say just skip ESXi for now. But it does have some really compelling features that, I hate to say it, makes it the best hypervisor out of these three. So first of all, it's not free. It's never going to be free. There are ways, the internet, but we're not going to go into that. Also, ESXi is the most mature hypervisor. It's got a very long and old code base, and it started off as a Linux distro, and it kind of is, but it's diverged away into its own thing where it's at the point where VMware basically doesn't mention Linux at all when it comes to ESXi. It's very, very easy to provision hardware, especially with PCIe pass-through. You can do it in about 4 seconds. The hypervisor itself is very fast. The I/O delay between getting access to the metal and having things connected virtually is, it's insanely responsive. So, there is that. Also, it has excellent networking and setup, and the configuration is really good, especially with the way that VMware handles virtual networking and virtual switches and SANs if you're going to the next level of storage. VMware has kind of always set the benchmark for virtualizing storage and all that stuff. So it is really, really good with VMware. Also, it's easier to set up an NFS connection. So let's say you've got an NFS server or a NAS or something, and you've got a bunch of virtual machines. You can add the virtual machine straight from that NFS storage to ESXi, and ESXi can just run as a host, and it can have that working as network storage. As well as that, if you're using something like vMotion, you can leave the virtual machines on that storage and then have a whole bunch of hosts in vSphere connected to that. And then you can, move your virtual machines around hosts easily. As well as that, the data store manager allows you to move virtual machines over NFS shares really quickly as well. So, there are quite a few portability things that make ESXi really good. And that's kind of why I got into it in the first place with my professional career, because I found all these little things. I'm like, hey, this is awesome. I want to do this for work. And I did. The major issue with ESXi for me, and the reason why I'm going to be choosing it, if you haven't guessed that already, is VMware and ESXi is a bit of a crutch for me because it's what I know best. I understand and know how all of these newer hypervisors work. I know them. They're basically all the same when it comes down to it. It's just the interface that you're looking at is slightly different. Things like VMware and ESXi have their own shell and their own commands for doing things. Also, XCP-ng and Xen have the same kind of thing. Proxmox is more geared towards using straight up Linux commands, which is nice too, which is something I know quite well. But also the decision for me to use ESXi is probably going to upset a whole bunch of people, but I don't care because right now, for what I want to do, it's working fine. And it also saves me time since I don't need to migrate any virtual machines because everything we've already got is on ESXi. So it just saves me a whole bunch of time. As well as that, I can use vMotion to move stuff as well. So I'll put this into perspective. I can live migrate my virtual machines that I've already got because I've got vSphere running on our other host in a virtual machine. I can plug this one in, add it to the cluster and just push everything across. And it saves me time having to not decommission a server straight away, basically. In the long term, I think the solution will probably be Proxmox because it is just really freaking good. I do need to figure out what is going on with the MS-01 randomly powering off because that's not acceptable, but I haven't seen that happen with ESXi or XCP-ng, but for now, it's going to be ESXi. That's just how it is. If it hasn't been super obvious from the jump, it's clear that I'm going to stick with ESXi for now. Couple reasons. First of all, stuff like this, like deploying a new virtual machine, I'm just going to show you how I would roll our TrueNAS scale virtual machine. This is me doing it from scratch. These options are super easy to get through. And the thing is, it doesn't need to be super technical. I want things to be quick and easy to manage. I'm basically just creating a blank virtual machine here. What you're seeing is I'm going to allocate the memory that I want to use for this virtual machine. This is one that's going into production. So we're going to put 16 gigs on this virtual machine. We're also going to move whichever virtual network it's on. I've only got this on here to install the operating system. I'll show you the entire network layout later because it is completely different to what I'm doing in this part. This is me setting up the hypervisor from scratch in the way that we need it. And essentially what I'm going to do here is switch this to an EFI boot setup. There's a weird bug with this. So you set up EFI boot and then you need to save the setting and then change it to BIOS and then back to EFI so it actually network boots from EFI. It's a whole thing. Yeah, look, I'm going to show you now. Look, edit the virtual machine. And I'm going to go to VM options. This is such a weird bug. This is something that's always existed. Go from EFI back to BIOS, click save. And we'll go back into the settings to edit it again. It just won't boot in EFI from PXE. It just won't do it. And then click EFI again, and then it'll give you some stupid warning, but it will be good to go. So let's just spin up this virtual machine. This is a fresh machine, nothing installed in it. Gonna do a PXE installation from scratch to show you how easy it is with our network setup. So I use a thing called iVentoy with a bunch of ISO files on one of our other servers. Basically grabs IP from the server, and I've got this list of ISOs I can choose to boot from when I'm installing any operating system on any computers in our network. So I've got like yeah, there's just a bunch of different operating systems here. So TrueNAS, and then just the latest version of TrueNAS Scale as I'm filming this video. And, you know, just really easy. Just let it install, do its thing. We can skip to the post-install bit because, you know, it just works. Network installations for operating systems with iVentoy is really easy. If you want to see a video on that, let me know. It is freaking cool and has saved me a lot of time over the last few months. Now that we've got our production version of TrueNAS Scale installed, I'll just do an LSPCI to show you what devices are connected to this virtual machine because it's got the final drives. I've got two 1TB NVMe M.2 drives for cache drives, and then you can also see that the storage card, which is that LSI controller, is connected to the virtual machine as well. So this is ready to go. The next step for all of this after setting up this live TrueNAS Scale virtual machine is something that I like about TrueNAS Scale, and the reason why we're going to keep using it for our storage solutions, and that is settings and exporting settings. It's got one of the easiest ways to export all your settings, import it into a new virtual machine, and everything's just exactly the same. So I don't need to migrate the virtual machine. Let's say I was going from ESXi to Proxmox. I don't need to migrate that virtual machine at all. I don't have to. I just do a clean install, import the config, and even things like the network config and everything will be exactly the same. So let's say, for instance, Claire's working on a photo. I do a live migration. I can just do a cutover and it'll be the same IP address, but it will be on a physical server that's changed. and the storage pool will be the same, but she wouldn't even know that I've done that, right? Because that's the way that I've set it up in the past, and that's the way we're going to keep setting it up. And you can do this stuff with other hypervisors as well, so there's no problem with doing that. But like, my recommendation is, like, this is just going completely off script here, but if you've already got a storage server and you're trying to move it somewhere else, but you want to keep the same storage pool without having to import the pool with ZFS in TrueNAS, just copy the config, fresh install a new version of TrueNAS, import the config, and you're good to go. That is the absolute easiest and best way to do it. It saves you having to worry about whether or not, let's say it's a virtual machine, you don't have to worry about any hardware compatibility. Let's say you go from Intel to AMD, like sometimes there can be a few things with hypervisors not liking the way certain CPUs do things and compatibility and all that. You don't have to worry about that. You just do it this way. Trust me, it's worked. I've done it about 40 times already, so yeah. There's something that maybe people might not talk about with these hypervisors, and that is memory management. Hear me out, right? So because I used all of these hypervisors over a weekend in close proximity to each other, usually you might not notice these things when you're trying to figure out what the best solution is for something, but because that time was so short between things, I noticed the different way these hypervisors do memory management, and only because our MS-01 has 32 gigs of RAM. With XCP-ng, what I noticed is, and I think I mentioned this earlier in the video, when you get close to your memory usage, it can make your hypervisor unstable. So let's say, for instance, TrueNAS has got 16 gigs, right? The way that XCP-ng will work is it'll be like, hey, this virtual machine needs 16 gigs. We're going to give it the full 16 gigs. And let's say then we have a Windows VM with 6 gigs of RAM, and then you have another Windows VM with another 6 gigs of RAM. That's another 12 gigs out of the pool used. And then you've only got a couple gig left, and then you've got Zen Orchestra running on 2 gigs of RAM on the side as well. But what XCP-ng does, and actually Proxmox does the same thing, is it allocates each slice of RAM as a, what's the word? It's thick provisioned. Let's say it's thick provisioned, so it's taking all of that memory, it's allocating it to when it needs it all of the time. As long as that machine's turned on, it's going to eat up all that memory. And like some of the stats I looked at with running Proxmox, and maybe you noticed it in some of the screen capture, but you'll see memory usage 99.7% or something crazy like that. Like, that's because it's just like you've sliced the memory off for each virtual machine. We're going to consume it. VMware doesn't work the same way. So say, for instance, you have a TrueNAS virtual machine with 2 M.2 drives allocated, storage card. Now, what VMware says is, if we're giving the virtual machine these PCIe devices, your RAM needs to be thick provisioned. You need to allocate all of that memory to that virtual machine so PCIe knows what to do with it, right? But for the Windows virtual machines that we don't attach any PCIe devices to, why do we need to give it all of the memory right now? So what VMware will do is, VMware will only consume what the virtual machine is using at that time dynamically. So in essence, you can over provision your memory sometimes. It doesn't always work, but depending on the way that the operating system handles memory, VMware is smart enough to say, hey, like, you're only using 3 gig right now, so we'll just only allocate 3 gigs to your virtual machine. The thing is, I'm sure there's a way to do it with other hypervisors, but it's not as obvious. And that can be a problem for some, but for me, like I said, like, I already have a solution that just set up and works. And all I need to do is copy a bunch of files to a new hypervisor, which is ESXi, and it just works. Like, again, it might not be everyone's choice on how to do it. It might not be your choice, and maybe you have like a moral dilemma with Broadcom. I do as well. I fucking hate that shit. It's so bad. Hopefully they listen and do something about it, but right now is a shitstorm. So yeah, I'm just gonna, remember, this is a production machine. It's not just like a home lab that some people have just for tinkering. This is to run a business and we need it to work. So yeah, that's why we're sticking with that for now. This is really just scratching the surface with what is possible with the MS-01. We're going to probably put this into production in the next week or so and plug the disk shelf in and all that stuff. The disk shelf and everything works with this already. That's kind of why I didn't talk about it in the video or show it, because I just didn't think there was really any point. It plugs in, it works, the storage pools come up, it's all good, right? We're ready to rock and roll. I just wanted to show you guys what I found when I was testing everything, because I think that's more important than showing you it in production, because I can just sit down on the floor, plug a bunch of 8088 SAS cables in the back. Hey, look at this thing, haha, that's fun. But without testing what the best solution is, I wouldn't have come to any types of conclusions. Now, this solution basically replaces the machine where Home Assistant runs for all of our home automation stuff. It also replaces the same box that we've got Pi-hole installed on. It replaces the box, I mean, this is all the same box, they're all virtual machines, but that Windows Server virtual machine that I use for a bunch of random stuff also replaces the remote desktop sessions that I run on our server as well in Windows 11. So this just replaces a big server. And the last thing is upgrading the memory. It's going to make it a lot easier. But for now, with how it is and using vMotion and just having the second host running in the meantime, because right now, I don't know if I mentioned this, but for the storage server at the moment, it's not running on the disk shelf. The primary drive's in that ZFS pool. I moved into a QNAP enclosure. I put a 10 gig NIC in it, and I installed TrueNAS on the metal on the QNAP. I think I did a video about it. I'll link that in the description. But yeah, other than that, yeah, this is just going to do everything again in a single box, and it makes me really happy. If you haven't seen the first video that we did with the MS-01, maybe that'll help explain why I decided to use the MS-01.